Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and here I'm reviewing the Fractal Focus 2. In this video I'm going to be talking about the various different highlights of this case, and I'm going to link to a video where I've gone into a lot more depth on the build process and showing how to build in it and talking about all the different things that happen there. But here I want to talk to you about the highlights of it, the lowlights, and the things of interest. Now this is an affordable case coming in at around £79 sterling, or about $69.99 in terms of dollars. It comes with 240mm fans front mounted, and here you can see some of the views of the end of the design and what it looks like, as well as some empty shots. Now it's variable in various different colors. Obviously I've got the white one here, and it's worth noting that you can also purchase it with an RGB setup. For this case though, I happen to have the white version without RGB fans, so it comes with 240mm fans as standard without any extra RGB lighting. Some interesting points about the optional purchases for this case, because for example it comes with two USB 3.0 ports on the front top, but what it doesn't have is USB-C as standard. That's an optional additional purchase for it. Another point on that in a minute, because you can purchase a couple of additional upgrades, but it's quite strange to see a lack of USB-C on it. Now as standard, it has those two 140mm fans on the front, which you can see have a pretty hefty gap between them. You could swap them out for three 120mm fans instead, which would probably look superior and a little bit nicer in my opinion. And you could obviously have a 360mm radiator on the front as well, and up to a 240mm radiator on the top. More on that in a little while. You can see that the front panel's removable, as is the sides, with relative ease, and that front panel has a nice bit of dust cover on it as well. So you can easily make sure that dust and dirt doesn't ingress into the case, which is obviously really beneficial in the long term. And there's a little tiny dust filter on the bottom next to the PSU as well, and a dust filter included for the top of the case should you want it. Now when you get around the rear, it's not that impressive in terms of the space that you've got. One of the things of note as well, as you'll see in a minute, is the power supply unit actually mounts on the front, which is pretty strange. Now you can see a close look at the case, you'll find that there are mounting points for hard drives. So you actually have two hard disk drive mounting points for 3.5-inch drives on the left-hand side there. And then on the right-hand side, you have points for two SSDs. Now this is the standard setup, just two SSDs or two hard drives or both. And you can buy additional upgrades so that you can add in extra drives. But again, it's an additional purchase. One of the curiosities of that is the way this mounts as well. So there's no hard drive caddy or separate mounting spot for the drives that actually mount directly to the case, which is fairly unusual. It's really easy for the installation process, as you're about to see a sample of that. Essentially all you have to do is put some screws and washers in place and then feed them through to the front of the case through the larger holes, and then slipping it down and tying it into the notches there, basically pushing it down and tightening it up there, and then flip back round to the front, and there's an additional screw that passes through the front hole in the top left, as you can see here, that tightens it down, and also you can tighten the other ones. So you then have a hard drive mounted to the back of the case. One of the things that I thought when I set this case up was that would probably lead to some hard drive noise, because I've experienced the same problem with the Fractal Torrent that I built previously. If I use hard drives in there, it becomes a little bit noisy, and you certainly can hear some of the vibrations and the drive spinning up through the case because of this. The SSD mounting, however, is really straightforward, because essentially there's some little things that jut out from the back of the case that you can see here that you just push your drive into and they clip in place. Obviously no moving parts in the SSDs means that you won't have that problem with drive noise. So if you're using SSDs and not drives, it won't be a problem. The next point for this case is that the PSU mounts on the bottom without any sort of shroud or cover, as you can see, which means you have to feed your cables through the back through this tiny gap down here. Now this is fairly unusual, and I think if you're good at cable management, it won't be a problem. You can see that there's a cable tidying loop just below here, for example, but if you're a bit rubbish at it like I am, then you might find that it becomes a bit messy. There are a number of different points for tying the cables down. You can actually see quite a few at the rear. There's no real decent cable channeling ports as such, but you do have plenty of space, I found, so it actually belies the size of the thing. It actually does really well in terms of managing the cables and setting it up, because there's a run on the right hand side, for example, where I'm running two 8-pin CPU power connectors along the side and up the top, and you can see that there are various points for mounting that all the way up to the top as well, so you can neaten things up quite nicely, and along the sides as well. But what you'll see in a second is there isn't really a cable hiding tray on the front, so you really have to be quite tidy with your cable management. And with the power supply I'm using, the cables are kind of floppy and all over the place, and it doesn't come with any combs as standard, so it does become a little bit messy, and if you're particularly fussy about this sort of thing, there might be an issue. Now for this build, I'm using the Fractal Lumen S24, which is a 240mm radiator that I'm going to do a separate video on. This is an all-in-one cooler with quite a stealthy look. It does have an RGB pump head, but the fans on it are stealthy black ones, which kind of match the overall design of the case. The reason I bring this up is because this presented a bit of a problem. So when you look in the manual, you will see that it gives you a warning about RAM, that you can only have a max clearance of 35mm if you're mounting on the top with a 240mm radiator or 120. Now, I did come across this problem, the issue with essentially trying to mount this radiator on the top. I actually think it wasn't caused by the RAM, though, interestingly. It's caused by the design of the case and also the hardware of the motherboard. So this is an ATX Strix motherboard, which has quite a lot of VRM shielding at the top, which juts out quite far. The result was that I couldn't quite push the radiator down into a position where I could easily mount it on top of the case, getting the screws into the place as necessary. You can see from this clip here, for example, it's just not quite possible to line up the holes with the slots on top of the case. Quite frustrating, and I did actually try some lower profile RAM, and that didn't solve the issue. The thing that's interesting is they obviously have noted that there is a problem because there's this extension bracket included in the case, which you can use for radiators. So it's essentially some brackets that you attach to the radiator that you're using for the top of the case, and then that adjusts the position of where the screws are going to sit and allows you to then actually attach it. So you can see it has 4 brackets, and essentially you need to mount 2 on one side and 2 on the other, but slightly different. So the ones at the back jut out further, they're stepped, so they sit upwards, and then you can see how I've mounted them here with the different points. What this does is obviously push basically the radiator's mounting brackets a little bit further back into the case, and this allows you to then mount it even if you've got an issue with larger RAM. So I actually do think the low profile mentioned on the RAM here isn't necessarily the case. Not able to say how big they could be, but I've certainly found that mine is bigger than the 35mm and it still fits. I'm using Corsair's new RAM, and I'll leave all the specs in the description so you can find out more if you're interested. But the end result was I managed to get it in there. Now you can see I'm a bit further into the build and I've got a lot more cables going on, and you can see that I have tied down quite a few of the different points, so things are looking a bit neater. But what you will see is there isn't any real channeling that you'd see elsewhere. That SATA cable that I'm running from the hard drives to the SSDs is a bit messy. You can tidy up some of these things. Obviously, the more drives you add in, the more fans you add in as well, it's become a problem. One of the other points of note here as well is that if you want to add in an extra fan at the rear, you can only fit a 120mm fan at the rear, which is an odd choice. Essentially, you can have 3 120mm on the front or 2 140mm, and you can only have 120mm on the rear. You can't have a 140, which seems a bit strange in my opinion, but you know, you've got to take some rough with the smooth here because this is an affordable case. So it is certainly nice, and it was relatively easy to build in apart from that one problem that I had with the radiator. The fans are also daisy chainable. Those front 2 fans actually have a daisy chain connection, so you can connect those up and then connect them up directly to your motherboard, which is fairly straightforward. The end result, as you can see here, we have those cables from the power supply unit painfully visible at this stage of the build. But what becomes interesting is, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, you could potentially tie it down to the bottom of the case. There is a loop down there, so I could have tightened it up a little bit more. And the other thing is that there is a little bracket on the door. So when you put the door on, it actually does hide it a little bit more. As I mentioned already, I did find that the back of the case actually was surprisingly roomy. I didn't think it was going to be when I first started building in it, or when I first took the door off. It didn't look like there was much space in there for cables. I thought by the time I got to the end of the video it would be a bit of an issue with fitting the cables in and closing the door nicely, but it didn't turn out that way at all. As I said, there's also a dust cover for the top if you want it. If you're having an air setup, for example, and you're not exhausting this way, or if you're like me and you're just paranoid about dirt getting into the case, then you have the option to use that. And here you can see the finished product. Quite a large space on the right hand side where there's not much going on, but otherwise quite a stealthy build. Obviously I'm going to do a video separately on the cooler if you want to see a bit more on that. But the Curiosity from multiple angles is quite a nice setup, I will say. I do find it's a little bit loud, and as I did note, there will potentially be an issue with drives spinning up. If you have two hard disk drives at the back there, that might be problematic. But otherwise, it's pretty nice looking. Reasonably good for the build and for the design of it. It's a good quality case. It does feel nice and solid. It doesn't feel cheap. So I wouldn't say it is a cheap feeling case or a cheap looking one. And the inclusion of 240mm fans is pretty nice for this amount of money. I just personally hate the size of the gaps between them. You can see rather huge gaps there. So when you put the door on, you'll see that there's a little notch sitting basically above the bottom of the door. It's like a shelf, which basically sits a little bit higher and is angled up. Once you put that in place, you can see it blocks a little bit of the power supply cables from view. So it's a bit easier to sort of hide those away or forgive the fact that they're sticking out a little bit there. Still fairly unusual to have a PSU mounted at the bottom in such a visible way, but if you have a nice looking power supply unit, let's say one with RGB lighting, or one like I'm using, which is a Strix one, and you're using custom cable mod cables, for example, which are a bit neater than the ones that I'm using, or premium sleeved cables, then it might not be as much of an issue. And if you're a bit more aggressive with the cable tidying, it'll probably look pretty nice. But a very stealthy build from multiple angles, apart from this bit jutting out, which is the only thing of annoyance for me. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the finished product. A nice case for the money. Just a few small weirdities, for example, having to pay for USB-C is a bit strange. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Check out the full build guide linked in the description. Thanks for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.